Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm Neil Van Leeuwen. I'm one of the co-hosts of the What is Belief seminar series. I'm here with Corey Cusimano, who's substituting for Tanya Lombroso. He's my co-host today. And we're very pleased to have Louis Sass as our guest. A couple notes before we get started. So we've added another talk in the series. So this would have been our last, but we're going to have another one in July, and that's on July 29th, I think. So please go ahead and mark your calendars. And we're going to have Hugo Mercier, author of this really fascinating book, Not Born Yesterday. So a really exciting addition to our talk series. But today, as I said, we're pleased to have Louis Sass. Louis is a distinguished professor in the Department of Clinical Psychology at Rutgers University, and he's one of the world's leading researchers on schizophrenia, and he's written some very prominent books on this matter, Paradoxes of Delusion and Madness and Modernism, and has received numerous awards like the Joseph Gittler Award from the American Psychological Foundation in 2010. So we're very pleased to have him. As always, we are funded by the John Templeton Foundation, and we are grateful to them for funding this series. So without further ado, Louis, please go ahead and take it away.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Neil, for the introduction, for the invitation. Thank you also, Corey and Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here. And I look forward to being able to present and also to the discussion. So the double bookkeeping on the nature of some delusional beliefs. This talk, wait a second here. There we go. Is largely based on an article from some years ago called Delusion and Double Bookkeeping. I'm going to offer a phenomenological approach today to the topic of delusion and schizophrenia, or rather to a particular aspect of schizophrenic delusion, as we might call it, which is the general quality of reality or actuality that the delusional world and delusional objects are felt by the patient to have. And in particular, I'll be talking about the notion of derealization. But first, let me list a few of the general features of a phenomenological approach to delusion. First, a focus on form over content. The phenomenologist typically, including me, puts less emphasis on what is experienced or asserted by the delusional patient than on how the patient seems to experience his or her delusional world and objects, and on what sort of reality or quality of existence might be ascribed to those delusional objects. Secondly, there's an appreciation and emphasis on the heterogeneity of delusional experience, both across different diagnoses and also within the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Thirdly, there's a general doubt about the adequacy of traditional definitions of delusion, at least within psychiatry, as being essentially a form of poor reality testing. The DSM definition of delusion has been for some years more or less like the following, this one from DSM-4, a false personal belief based on incorrect inference about external reality and firmly sustained in spite of what almost everyone else believes, and in spite of what constitutes incontrovertible proof or evidence to the contrary. Now, many patients with pure paranoid psychosis and some with affective psychoses do seem to fit this definition fairly well, but it's often noted that deluded patients with schizophrenia often do not act as if their delusions were or implied truth claims. Eugen Bleuler, who's the psychiatrist who coined the term schizophrenia, spoke here of what he called double bookkeeping, giving the example of a patient who insisted that his psychiatrist had been misdirecting his mail, but who would then ask the psychiatrist to be so kind as to post his next letter. The fourth and final feature is an appreciation of the inherent difficulty of describing such experiences. And the fifth feature is that phenomenology anticipates and expects really that the forms of human experience may be profoundly diverse, involving radical alterations in the most basic structures of experience, including dimensions of time, space, causality, and self-experience. So let me turn to the topic that I mentioned of derealization, a concept that refers to an altered quality of the very phenomenality of the world. Derealization is in fact a prominent feature of schizophrenic experience and may affect the experience of both the actual and the delusional world. Though well known in psychology, its significance may not have been sufficiently appreciated, and its varieties have not perhaps been satisfactorily described. So this derealization, or perhaps we should say these forms of derealization, may well be the most crucial aspect of delusion in schizophrenia, but they're also difficult to characterize or to comprehend. We're dealing here with the all-encompassing ontological dimension that, as philosopher Martin Heidegger teaches us, is so easily forgotten or ignored. The forgetting of the ontological, as Heidegger speaks of. Here, however, we're concerned not just with certain alterations in the quality of object, space, or bodily sensations, but with challenges to what the founding phenomenologist Edmund Husserl called the natural attitude itself, namely to the very sense of encountering an objective or shared world, and thus to its ontological status in the full sense of that term. Excuse me one sec. Now, the challenge of understanding is exacerbated by the fact that there is no single delusional alternative to the lived world of the natural attitude, but rather a gamut of ways in which things or the world may lack or otherwise deviate from normal reality. Each of these ways is itself both strange and ambiguous, and these disconcerting qualities are compounded by the fact that the experiential modalities may at times slip or slide into one into the other. The overall feel of the delusional world has been aptly described as peculiarly insubstantial, evanescent, and hovering, and as having a conceptual halo of the fantastic. A young woman named Sophie, a pseudonym, of course, who suffers from schizophrenia, states that based on her own past experience and careful reflection, derealization is the universal and defining feature of psychotic or delusional experience, what she speaks of as the single most pervasive, enduring, and destabilizing world disturbance in schizophrenia. These quotes are taken mostly from emails between her and me. But what precisely is derealization? Is there anything we can say to clarify it beyond the mere wielding of the term? Sophie herself explains that derealization can take many forms and is not restricted to experiences involving obvious forms of diminished intensity or vitality. It may also involve, she says, increases in metaphysical dynamism, universal animism, emotional resonance, human or divine purposeness. These, quote, have clearly and unambiguously led me to feel that the world is profoundly unreal. And then she says, as I have in the slide there, again from her email, the common factor is not a loss of dynamism or vitality, but simply radical change. Faced with people who no longer feel anything like normal people, the people one has lived with one's whole life, for any reason, the logical conclusion is that they are simply not real. My paper is going to be filled with quotations from Sophie, and in fact, you could describe this paper really as a kind of dialogue with her. And Sophie is a person of exceptionally high intelligence and highly intellectual, well-read in philosophy and psychology, by the way. And in that sense, of course, she's not typical of people with this diagnosis or people in general. It seems clear enough that the radical change to which Sophie refers, whereby things seem simply not real, involves a loss of the standard reality with which one is most familiar and feels most at ease. Sophie speaks, in fact, of not feeling at home. The hovering strangeness and ambiguity that tends to transfix and unhinge the patient is clearly ontological in nature, having to do with the overall quality of the feel of reality. But does it necessarily involve a loss of the sense of things being real in the more specifically defined, yet general sense of lacking the objectivity implied by Husserl's notion of the natural attitude? That is, the quality of existing, so to speak, out there in the world, independent of the mind that experiences it. Might it even be described as a subjectivized or even solipsistic reality, a realm felt to exist only for, or even perhaps to be created by, the patient or the person who witnesses it? Now, the answer I'll be giving to this question is perhaps yes, perhaps no, in some respects yes, in some no. These anomalies of experience tend, in fact, to be as elusive to the theorist who would describe them as they are disconcerting to the patient who lives them. So let's look first at some of the more extreme and clear-cut forms of derealization. Later, we'll consider some forms that are more ambiguous and more likely to be confusing, both to the patient and to the theorist. Now, perhaps the most detailed analysis of this particular issue, that is the reality status of the delusional world, is offered in my own little book, an entire book really on the topic, called the Paradoxes of Delusion, Wittgenstein, Schreber, and the Schizophrenic Mind. There I offer a phenomenological analysis of the delusional world of the most famous psychotic or schizophrenic patient in the history of psychiatry, that is Daniel Paul Schreber, author of the famous Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, more accurately translated as Great Thoughts of a Mental Patient, translated from the German. In his memoirs, Schreber describes an elaborate delusional world consisting of what he calls souls, gods, also of nerves and rays that seem to span the cosmos, to connect him with God, and often to monitor or control his own thoughts and actions. Schreber speaks of being, among many other things, of being transformed into a woman, of losing his stomach and having it reappear repeatedly. He speaks of foreign beings inhabiting his consciousness and controlling his thoughts. He sometimes experienced the actual people around him as being mere, as he called them, fleeting improvised men who had been set down by God to fool him. Now, these delusions have often been taken as very clear instances of poor reality testing. As, for example, when in a legal brief, the superintendent of the asylum wrote of Schreber, "What objectively are delusions and hallucinations are to him unassailable truth and adequate motive for action." But though Schreber clearly took these delusional realities very seriously, he speaks, in fact, of his revelations as affording him deeper insight than that available to all other human beings. And he's confident of their truth value in some sense. He does not seem to ascribe to them the kind of reality status or ontological weight of something that we might call objectively real, or in which he could be said fully to believe, at least in the standard sense of that term. Schreber himself, in a legal document, rejects the superintendent's characterization. The non-literal nature of Schreber's delusion is apparent, for instance, in his own description of being transformed into a woman. As he explains in his memoir, this event occurred when Schreber would stand before a mirror, looking at himself while stripped to the waist and wearing feminine jewelry. As he stared at his own torso, he would feel the approach of what he called the rays, which constitute an important center of consciousness in his delusional world. And then he wrote in his memoir, quote, "My breast gives the impression," you have the German equivalent, Eindruck, "of a pretty well-developed female bosom," end quote. And attentive reading of Schreber's description makes it clear that he is not describing an actual anatomical change, doesn't think he's describing that, but something more like a way of seeing or construing an unchanged physical reality. Quote, "Naturally, hairs remain on my chest. My nipples also remain small as in the male sex," end quote. Indeed, Schreber even describes it as an illusion, Illusion in German. Thus, he speaks of getting, quote, "the undoubted impression of a female trunk, especially when the illusion is strengthened by some feminine adornments," end quote. Elsewhere in his memoir, Schreber describes what he calls picturing, Zeichnung, or representing, which may occur in a more passive or a more active manner, and which involves use of the human imagination, he says, quoting now, "for the purpose of producing pictures, Bilder." Typically, Schreber does not make claims about the external or interpersonally shared world, claims that could be supported or refuted by evidence independent of the experience itself. His delusional beliefs are described in a way that gives them a coefficient of subjectivity, we might say, as when he says, for example, not "I am a scoffer at God," or "I am given to voluptuous excesses," but "I am represented, dargestellt," as one of these things. Schreber was also acutely aware of the difficulty of conveying the precise nature of his experiences and the likelihood of being misunderstood by his readers. Quote from Schreber, "Again, it is extremely difficult to describe such changes in words because matters are dealt with which lack all analogies of human experience and which I appreciated directly only in part with my mind's eye, mit meinem geistigen Auge. To make myself at least somewhat comprehensible, I shall have to speak much in images and similes, which may at times perhaps be only approximately correct." And in fact, in accord with this recognition, Schreber peppered his original text, in German of course, with such phrases as English equivalent would be "in part," "on the other hand," "so to speak," "up to a point," "in a way," all of which imply a certain non-literal and self-aware quality that is quite apparent in the original German, but incidentally, these phrases were omitted in the English translation because they were deemed to be irrelevant and just muddying up the text. Of course, they change. That makes a big change to omit those. So we see that the delusions of at least this very classic case lack the kind of objective or intersubjective referentiality that would seem to be implied by the standard poor reality testing formula, which uses terms like false, incorrect, and absurd. What's suggested is something rather more akin to Bloiler's double bookkeeping, where the patient experiences the delusional reality as existing in a different ontological domain from that of everyday reality. As Sophie put it, again in an email, "I often feel that many of my aberrant pseudo-perceptions feel the way they do because I am actually perceiving them taking place in a parallel reality that only partially overlaps with this one." The standard natural attitude in normal life involves the sense that the objects one experiences are intersubjectively present. The physical objects, for example, present to the gaze of awareness of other persons who are separate from and yet similar to oneself. Also implied is the assumption that objects exist within the framework of space, time, and causality, namely as occupying a particular locus in an indefinitely spatial indefinitely large spatial universe accessible to others, and within a single unidirectional flow of time that emerges from a now unchangeable past and opens directly onto a more open future. All this being taken for granted. It's understandable that any deviation from these structural features will be experienced as a form of derealization. And as we've seen, the derealization of the delusional realm can imply a certain subjectivization. That is, a sense that the realities in question have what we might call an immanent rather than a transcendent significance, that they are true for me in my mind's eye as immediate experiential realities rather than as entities existing somehow out there, accessible to other consciousnesses. Various psychiatric phenomenologists, including Blankenberg and Tatosian, have pointed out the affinity between this kind of delusional stance and the fundamental nature of phenomenological bracketing, or the phenomenological reduction itself, which are the key methodological moves of Husserlian phenomenology. In phenomenological bracketing, one sets aside the objectivist claims of the natural attitude in order to isolate an immanent realm of pure experiencing, a realm from which doubt can presumably be expunged, and within which apodictic, to use a word that Husserl was fond of, or absolute certitude can be achieved. Another close affinity, but not, as we will see, an identity, is with the experiential stance or modality of imagination. As the philosopher Edward Casey points out in his book, Imagining a Phenomenological Study, the imaginary is characterized by the qualities of self-containedness and self-evidence. The self-containedness involves a felt discontinuity or delimitation from other psychological acts, such as perception and memory. It implies as well a certain unexplorability. The imagined object, insofar as it exists at all, is given all at once, without a backside or hidden depth. It is also self-evident in the sense of being non-corrigible, non-falsifiable, non-verifiable, and apodictic in the sense of containing a kind of indubitable presence and certainty. Hence, quoting from Casey, I cannot doubt that what I imagine is appearing to me precisely as it presents itself to me. Another interesting feature of imagining mentioned by Casey is its interesting combination of spontaneity and controlledness, of a certain effortless, surprising, and self-generating quality that coexists or sometimes changes place with a sense of somehow being able to initiate, guide, and terminate a given process or flow of imagination. This is consistent with another patient named Anna's noting of an association between her tendency to attend too vividly to her own stream of consciousness and a delusion or quasi-hallucination she had that a bust of Plato was talking to her when she was in a hallway at a university. It wasn't as if this bust suddenly started talking to me out of thin air. I wanted him to, and then I sort of convinced myself that he did. I didn't feel like I was passively being subjected to another reality. It felt like I was somehow actively engaged in creating it. Now, drawing these parallels may help to explain a feature of many schizophrenic delusions that might otherwise seem strange. The characteristic combination of what Karl Jaspers, the great psychiatrist and author of the General Psychopathology, called certitude with inconsequentiality. And especially the seemingly odd fact that it is often the delusion about which the patient is most certain, with regard to which he or she is least likely to act. Now, if one imagines the delusion being believed in the context of something like a subjectively maintained natural attitude, this would make little sense. Surely one ought to act in relationship to that whose existence one most assumes. But if the delusion is felt to be true only for me, in my mind's eye, for me alone, then the contradiction is resolved. One need hardly seek evidence for an experience, which is akin in this sense to the imaginary, that makes no claim with regard to objective or intersubjective reality. And one will hardly take action in actuality with regard to what one knows to exist in a purely virtual realm. This provides a phenomenological way of accounting for at least some instances of the famous double bookkeeping, of which Bleuler spoke. The patient who claims he is God or Napoleon, yet willingly sweeps the floor, would presumably recognize that this God status is purely subjective, a kind of imaginary truth holding within his own mind's eye world, and therefore irrelevant to the daily routine of life on the hospital ward. Such a patient may also sense, in some manner or level of awareness, that delusional events, like imagined ones, may come and go without the usual consequences. Hence, people may die yet come to life, or may travel to the sun without being burned. An additional feature of many schizophrenic delusions also follows. And this is the fact that in the main, such patients do not proselytize or attempt to convert others to their beliefs, as if they sensed or somehow knew that the delusional reality was not only inaccessible, but irrelevant to others. A psychiatrist named Müller-Suhr, Swiss psychiatrist, asked his paranoid and his schizophrenic patients, not all paranoid patients, of course, are schizophrenic, so he's separating these two groups, how certain they were of their delusions. The paranoiacs believed in their basic experience with a relative certainty, and this certainty increased only gradually with the passage of time. By contrast, reports Müller-Suhr, his schizophrenia patients claimed to be absolutely certain, with 100% certainty, as certain as that 2 + 2 = 4 about their delusions, even when these delusions seemed absurd to the listener. Now, the metaphor of double bookkeeping in its simplest form seems to imply the existence of two distinct realms that, like an accountant's two ledgers, are kept strictly apart. There's the real, perhaps boring, perhaps threatening world of actual intersubjective practical reality. And then there's the more satisfying realm of the imaginary, which on a certain phenomenological analysis is actually felt or implicitly recognized by the patient to be perhaps imaginary, or at least subjectivized, in some sense unreal. Now, this does appear to approximate the condition of certain chronic schizophrenia patients for whom delusional reality affords reliable escape from both the content and the form of the real. As we saw in the case of Schreber, the delusional world in schizophrenia can indeed have a distinctively subjectivized quality that sets it apart from the world of the natural attitude. Delusional objects or the entire delusional world may be felt to be available only to oneself, or indeed to exist only for oneself. I often feel, writes Sophie, that many of my aberrant pseudo-perceptions feel the way they do because I'm actually perceiving them taking place in a parallel reality that only partially overlaps with this one. There is, she says, the sense that the world, universe, reality is doubled, multiplied, that there are parallel worlds and or multiple alter realities, and or that reality as such is actually fractured. At times it appears, end quote, at times it appears the patient may have a sense of relative confidence about this subjective aspect of the delusional world. And this may permit her to exist either simultaneously or successively in two rather distinct spheres without much confusion or uncertainty. In an email, Sophie writes, for instance, I can feel absolutely certain that space and time, and hence physical reality, no longer or never did exist. and yet understand that in order to get to a psychiatry appointment, I have to walk down the street, get on the train, and so on, physically navigate or move through the objective world. Or I can feel certain, even as I am talking to my psychiatrist, that I killed him 5 minutes earlier, fully aware that he is sitting a few feet from me talking. The strangeness is that both beliefs exist simultaneously and seem in no way to impinge on one another. And Sophie describes a capacity to navigate between realities in order to achieve her own purposes. In both our cases, as we discussed, she's referring here now to conversations with John, a friend also with schizophrenia who lived on the streets for about 10 years, also highly intelligent and intellectually oriented. Okay, in both our cases, as we discussed, we, John and I, have tended to feel that clinicians are quite predictable. If you want them to take you seriously, to express empathy or concern, you have to express full conviction without insight. If, on the other hand, you want to avoid hospitalization or further coercion or medications, or simply get out of the hospital, you play the other side and pretend that you are experiencing no delusional thoughts whatsoever. A huge part of the problem is clinicians' general failure to in any way accept this strange form of double belief or quasi-belief. Last week, I spent an entire hour trying to convince my therapist, for example, that one could be simultaneously convinced of two competing realities, and thus that insight should not be understood as something that simply increases only as delusional conviction decreases. And yet I clearly failed to get this point through to her. I will undoubtedly have to resort to my usual strategies in the future. John, who I should emphasize clearly was and is quite crazy, describes the whole thing repeatedly as performance and theater, end quote. We see then that the analysis in terms of double bookkeeping may sometimes fit the case, but more often it must be admitted, things are not quite so clear-cut, nor so potentially reassuring for the deluded patient. Often the parallel realities can be more difficult to distinguish one from another. The patient may feel uncertain as to which track he or she is on, or may even feel that the different tracks are intersecting, even fusing with each other in unanticipatable ways. There's the possibility, in fact, that rather than double bookkeeping, the patient will experience something closer to what I'm going to call something like a kind of photographic double exposure, a merging of two perspectives on reality, perhaps akin to what's found in the famous contamination response on the Rorschach ink blot test. Does this in effect bring us back, after all, to the original poor reality testing formula that we thought we had rejected, according to which the patient is mistaken or unable to distinguish because he takes the imaginary for the real? I think not, but to understand how or why this is not the case, we need to consider some further examples. The notion of poor reality testing generally implies that the patient takes the imaginary for real, that the patient believes in his imaginary objects with essentially the same form of belief as we, say, normal people, address to our surrounding world. The notion of double bookkeeping implies that the patient is well aware of the distinction between the imaginary and the real, or senses it. But what often occurs may fit neither of these formulae. It may involve less a sense of everything being real than of everything being unreal. Thus, Schreber experienced actual people in his asylum as what he called the fleeting improvised men. And that meant beings who only existed when he laid eyes on them. A mode of experience in which everything has a tinge of unreality. Now, taking action towards something is sometimes, but all too readily, I think, taken as an index of belief in the reality of that thing. But it should be noted that even this need not be the case. Indeed, a patient may feel that just as his actual objects are but dream objects, so his real actions are in a sense but dream actions, lacking the consequentiality or finality of real actions in the real world. Indeed, this may help to explain how some patients can perform unthinkable acts of self-mutilation without seeming to register the finality of what they've done. Here it is not that fantasy seems real, but that even reality is incorporated somehow into the unreality of a delusional realm, a realm in which serious injuries can be fleeting events, in which even death loses its finality, and one can perish and yet be resurrected an infinity of times. So we see that the derealization typically affects not only a separate delusional realm of fantasies, but also the experiences of one's actual body, thoughts, and surrounding world. Given this nearly universal derealization that can occur, it's understandable that the very distinction between realms can come into question. For as Sophie herself states, often I feel like a big part of the problem is precisely that I lose my conceptual, metaphysical, and experiential grasp of what reality is, was, or should be. Isn't the general confusion of perception, fantasy, memory, and imagination simply a ubiquitous part of each and every delusion? It's in fact this kind of derealization, all-encompassing derealization and ontological insecurity that's perhaps the most profound source of anxiety in schizophrenia and the sine qua non, you might say, of the delusional world. The potential for confusion becomes clearer if one recognizes that two worlds may differ not in the objects they contain, but in the attitude taken toward these objects. Instead of two worlds, there may be something more like an awareness of two distinct ways of seeing things, or of ways things can appear. And going along with this, a sense that, as Sophie puts it, quote, even the most fundamental conditions of possibility of the world can seem to be both profoundly changed and also unchanged. There certainly then is some potential for confusion between the realms she calls aberrant and normal. It's crucial to recognize, however, that there was also the sense of a meaningful distinction, albeit equivocal and wavering, more disconcerting than reassuring, between two or more realms. One involving something closer to the standard reality of the natural attitude, the other involving various forms of derealization, often including subjectivization. Now, this whole question of ontological status and of how it can or should be described is complicated by the fact that schizophrenic subjectivity and worldhood, as we might call it, can be altered at the most basic level of what is known as ipseity, core self, or pre-reflective selfhood. This both facilitates and complicates the ontological alterations inherent in delusional reality. Now, this core disturbance of ipseity, as we call it, as it's called, of minimal or basic self, of being a sense of being a subject at all, has been fairly extensively studied and written about in psychiatric and psychological research in the last 10 or 15 years. And it does involve, as you may know, some fundamental disruption or attenuation of the very sense of existing as a coherent or vital subjective experience or first-person perspective on the world. This typically involves disturbance of the normal sense of both ownership and control, of being able to control one's own thoughts and actions, or even of really possessing the thoughts, emotions, or perceptions that are occurring to one. Now, when alterations as fundamental as this can occur, the meaning of distinctions we normally take for granted, such as subjective versus objective, or active versus passive, are called into question. A term such as subjective does not have its usual meaning if we consider the possibility of experiencing one's own experience as somehow belonging to another being. That is, as being subjective, yet alien at the same time. Consider Schreber's experience of a seeing or representing of the femininity of his own torso. A seeing that is somehow not his own because it belongs to the rays, even though it is he himself who stands before the mirror and is doing the staring. The very meaning of subjectivization changes when one countenances possibilities of this kind. Indeed, the most basic frameworks of our existing, such as real or subjective, are altered when one applies them in a context whose ontological dimensions have shifted. Whereas some of the features of the real may be present in certain delusional states. For example, there may be the sense that I cannot control delusional objects or situations. Other features of the real may be absent, such as the sense that events are consequential and in some sense irreversible. The technique used by both Heidegger and Derrida of writing certain metaphysical terms while simultaneously crossing them out, terms like subjectivity, objectivity, real, would in fact be very appropriate in discussing the realm of delusions. Can I go on for another 3 minutes or so? Is that okay?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Now, it can help to compare the delusional condition with certain other more familiar conditions, such as imagination or dreaming, as long as one recognizes that these will offer only partial analogies. The status of the imaginary is somewhat different from that of delusion. Here, the role of convention and intersubjectivity is less prominent. In imagination, one may well journey in worlds felt to be unknown to others or devoid of their presence. And one may be aware, perhaps must be aware, of being oneself the constituting source who creates and grounds the imaginary realm. But for the normal individual, and even for the artist or writer, except perhaps in the throes of a creative trance, the imaginary realm remains somehow subordinated to the primacy of the natural attitude. No matter how fascinating it may be, the imaginary continues to be experienced as lacking the ontological weight we associate with the word reality. As a result, the famous suspension of disbelief, characteristic of imaginary or aesthetic experience, is never complete enough to allow the imaginary to become the dominant realm, to eclipse reality and replace it with something else. Now, the standard explanation for why such an eclipse sometimes does occur in schizophrenia will often point to some supposed cognitive deficiency, some inability to monitor external reality or the boundary between the internal and the external world. Seldom, however, do schizophrenic delusions seem to involve the rather blooming, buzzing confusion that this would seem to imply. It may be more apt to emphasize a matter of attitude or orientation, namely, shall we call it a somewhat autistic stance, in the old psychiatric sense of the word autistic, let me just pass over that for the moment. Anyway, that fails or refuses to accept the organizing horizon of intersubjectivity and the natural attitude. The mark of delusion in schizophrenia may be the fact that such persons find it natural to put more or at least equal faith in their own immanent experiences rather than in the shared objective world. Unlike the normal person who only sojourns in the imaginary, the individual with schizophrenia does not have the same unshakable faith in the public, the objective, the ordinary. But this means that delusional experience may not fit the model of either the real or the imaginary, since the standard and defining distinction between the two has been radically displaced. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You'll have to imagine a chorus of applause from our wonderful group of attendees. Thank you very much, Dr. Sass. This was really, really fascinating. We're entering the question and discussion portion of this talk. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat. Neil and I will be monitoring them, and we will, if they're very short, we might just read them out for Dr. Sass. If they're longer, we might call on you to sort of say your question out loud. Go ahead and start typing your questions in there. While people are typing out questions, just to make sure we have discussion getting forward, I'll ask the first question, which is, Dr. Sass, one of the things I think you're contrasting is a double bookkeeping version of, like, description of schizophrenia, and how that might be different from just thinking about the delusions that schizophrenics have, as you might think of, like, more extreme cases of otherwise ordinary false beliefs or irrationalities that might be characteristic of other kinds of psychopathology. One of the things I was wondering if you could speak on a little bit is what's the sort of like practical upshot of thinking about of characterizing schizophrenia in the double bookkeeping way, as opposed to sort of as their delusions on a more sort of continuous difference in sort of quantity rather than quality from other sorts of psychopathology? Are there things that clinicians should do differently if they have a double bookkeeping view of schizophrenia compared to other kinds of theories of schizophrenia? And then I'll go ahead and look at the chat.
Sure. Well, I think the implications for a psychotherapeutic treatment are important. CBT for psychosis, has mostly emphasized the treatment of delusions in patients with psychosis, including many patients with schizophrenia. And the emphasis there has been mostly, this is a bit of an oversimplification because it's, these are complicated domains of discourse, but mostly has focused on in a diplomatic way, helping the patient come to see the irrationality of his or her delusions. And by the way, the efficacy of that form of treatment is not particularly impressive, although there is some empirical evidence that it can be helpful. What is helpful in the treatment is always unclear, though. Is it the fact that you're sitting with a patient, or is it what you're doing in particular? The phenomenological viewpoint would not go at things in that direction, but would rather focus, I think, more on, well, perhaps not necessarily on considering the propensity for delusion as necessarily being itself so terribly pathological, but rather focusing on the intersubjective orientation or lack thereof of the patient. And so rather than focusing on the incorrectness of this or that belief and how it doesn't correspond to evidence, there would be more of an attempt to, I think, bring the patient into a kind of relationship with the therapist such that the patient would choose, I say that, I don't mean entirely volitionally or consciously, but would choose more often to be together with others and to live in that kind of world rather than in the private universe. So I think it's really quite significant. Some of us, we've written a couple of articles, published a couple of articles offering a phenomenological critique of CBT for psychosis, which go into this topic in more detail if anyone's interested.
Thank you very much. So Don Moore asks a really fascinating question. And I think Neil Van Leeuwen just asked a very related sort of question as well. So Don asks, to what extent do you think the pathologies you describe capture something about the way that all of us, including people who might not be schizophrenic, struggle to simultaneously process both perception and imagination? And because I think
I didn't hear the last thing. How all of us, what?
Struggle to simultaneously process both perception and imagination. And I'm going to tack on Neil's question to this because I think it's related, which is, do you think that derealization can sometimes be a feature of, even maybe rarely, of people who aren't schizophrenic?
Yes, certainly. Taking the last question first, derealization is a very widespread psychiatric symptom or human phenomenon, And you have, it's certainly very, very important in PTSD and in panic disorder, in schizoid personality, which need not necessarily lead to schizophrenia, and in normal responses to grief. So derealization is a multifaceted phenomenon. And that's also, by the way, something that we've done some studies on, looking at similarities and differences between, for example, panic disorder and schizophrenia, where the difference that we find has to do with the absence of a profound disruption of the sense of being of having a minimal self is not present in panic disorder, whereas it is present in schizophrenia. So derealization itself is certainly a phenomenon that's very widely found. The general question of sort of what are the affinities between schizophrenia and normal experiences is a very complicated one, because of course there's a sense in which there's a famous quote in psychiatry from Harry Stack Sullivan in which he says that people with schizophrenia are, quote, more human than otherwise. That's often quoted in clinical settings, and that's a kind of in a way, a beautiful statement, also a true statement, that there are many things that they share with us. And I think that can lead people with very good intentions to want to kind of efface the difference and say, well, we're all sort of similar, just matters of degree and nuance and things like that. And okay, there's some value in taking that perspective, but I think there's also something that can be lost if you push it too far, because there are, at a certain point, kind of qualitative differences that are maybe not absolute, but nevertheless significant. So that's the one I was trying to get at the very end of the talk, that we all, I think most people, and also most mental patients, by the way, most psychiatric patients who are not schizophrenic or at least psychotic, don't have this propensity to take as seriously the imminent world of, within one's own mind's eye. That just doesn't, that's not an option for most of us. Even though we may, dwell in the imaginary for a while and be drawn to it, in the end, what the phenomenologist Schutz called the working world, the sort of fundamental practical reality, has the most fundamental weight. So I think that that's a difference, an important difference.
Thank you. Mark, go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks. So I can pick up from that. I really want to just bring it back to the theme of the seminar and basically ask you sort of the role of serious classification, serious understanding and analysis of the crucial notion of belief. So you described, I was very struck by Sophie's hour-long debate about two competing realities or something like that, she said. And it strikes me as important that the phenomenon of mutually contradictory beliefs is a special case of competition. Physical objects, for example, can compete for space. You can't have two distinct, discrete ones in the same space. Notoriously, of course, in dreams, you can sort of experience a world in which that happens kind of regularly. And when we wake up, we tend to take that as an index of the dream status. And as you've been saying, that maybe schizophrenics actually do experience the working world in these odd ways. but to focus the question, you talked about, having a kind of unshakable sense of reality or something, and yet not acting on it. And the question basically would be, look, why don't we reserve the term belief precisely for what you will act on, as Peirce suggested following Alexander Bain, right? Do I think the ice is thick enough to walk across the lake?
Mhm.
I can swear up and down that I think it is, but if when push comes to shove, I don't walk across, you're not going to believe that I believe that. I might believe that I believe it, but I still don't really believe it. Quine talks about recalcitrant experience, and a final way to focus the question is, how exactly do we distinguish this perfectly sincere, very strange and fascinating kind of phenomenon that you've talked about from garden variety confidence people pretending to be blind and being caught out when they react to something threatening, which shows that they actually can see, even though they're pretending to be blind.
Right. Well, you've said so many things, very interesting comments, thank you. But you've said so many things, I'm not sure which direction to go first. I mean, the last thing you said about the confidence man is maybe you were, maybe I don't know what made you think of that, but it might be the statement by John when he said it's all performance and theater, if you remember that. And that's sort of, that might seem to suggest that the people with delusions are just kind of pretending to have their delusions. And I think that that's, there's some truth to that, but also some falsehood to that, that I think the either or ways that we tend to think about reality and as analytic philosophers, but also as sort of commonsensical human beings, often do not apply. So there is, it's always betwixt and between. But there are, other instances of patients with delusions, talking about the performative aspect of what they're doing, and yet they also believe in what they're doing. I don't know, maybe an analogy is method acting, although even that will probably not be a fully adequate analogy, because I presume that the person engaged in method acting sort of nevertheless has in the background some kind of awareness that I'm just pretending, even though I'm believing in what I'm pretending in the moment. And I think that background awareness doesn't play the same role in this kind of schizophrenic delusion. And by the way, I'm not saying that all delusions have this quality. Remember, I've very much emphasized the heterogeneity of delusions. And I also quoted Muller-Suhr on how many paranoid delusions probably do fit reasonably well the poor reality testing formula, pure paranoid delusions. And one of the criticisms that I have I'm sorry, I'm getting off your question here a little bit, sorry for that. But one of the criticisms that I have of a lot of what's been done on delusions is that they follow what I call the paranoia paradigm, that they assimilate all delusions to the situation of a paranoid patient who really does believe on the basis of some little clue that there's someone, right around the corner coming after him with a knife. And that's what sort of delusion is mistaken inference from minimal cues about something that's then believed to be real. Well, I don't say that kind of delusion doesn't exist. It does, and it's important, but a lot of delusions in schizophrenia are not of that nature. Another thing you talked about, which I already did address a little bit, is the question of whether acting on something means that you believe it. But you have patients whose actions are felt by them to occur in that mind's eye world kind of dream state, and so I don't think it does work as a criterion. You could say, well, that's not really action, I suppose, because action implies a belief that you're doing something in the real world. but that's not going to work very well as a behavioral criterion, certainly, because you have to enter into their world to make that distinction. So I'm not a very helpful guide when it comes to making distinctions. I think my predilection is much more for sort of trying to shoot holes in them all. My predilections go in a distinctively Wittgensteinian direction in that respect. So I'm dubious about the ability to make these sharp distinctions, including even that one that you, which is very plausible. That you believe in. If you believe in it, you act on it. Well, not really. I probably missed several of the things that you said.
This is, we're a few minutes after 10, so I think this is a good place to close up the discussion. I know people have places to be. I think a round of applause for our wonderful speaker again. Thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. So this was really wonderful. And don't forget, everybody, that we have our final talk of the series in a few weeks with Hugo Mercier. And in the meantime, have a happy Friday, everybody.
Thank you to everybody.